Let me start by saying that my mom is super rational and level-headed. She is a cool head in any emergency and rarely freaks out or loses her composure. She's not the type to make up stories or lie, so I believed it was true when she told me about this encounter. My mother is in her 70s now, and this story takes place when she was in her 20s, so 50 some odd years back. My mom was still living at home after finishing college because she was still looking for a job. My grandparents were traveling around the country together at that point, and they were not home when this incident occurred. Her family had lived in this house since she was 12, so she had been there for a long time and never really saw anything weird until now. One night she woke up from a dead sleep for no apparent reason in the middle of the night. Off to her left, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a soft white glow. My mom turned her head and saw the figure of a woman float from the wall and begin to cross the room slowly. So, she said that this had to be a ghost or whatever, because there was no way that this was a human being moving at this rate and being so, glowy. She said that this thing, whatever it was wearing a long white gown like the ones people wore back to sleep in the olden days. The ghost stopped in the middle of the room, turned to look at her, but it never spoke a word. After a couple of seconds, it continued to cross the room, passing through the opposite wall, and vanished out of sight. The whole encounter was maybe like 2-3 minutes at most. The next day, my mom called my grandpa and told him what happened, but he didn't believe her and thought she was just dreaming. A few days after this incident, she found an apartment and moved out because it scared her that badly. This story takes place on a lake in central New Hampshire, just a few miles north of the base of Mount Kearsarge. My friend has a cabin there, and his grandfather built it shortly after returning from the Second World War, and one warm summer night between my junior and senior years of high school, he and I were there, just hanging out. While we did drink and partake in the ganja from time to time, we were not intoxicated in any way on this night. We had simply been bored in our little hometown about 30 miles or approximately 48 kilometers to the south. So on a whim one evening, we decided to drive up and spend the night there, to light a fire and sit by the water on the beach chairs, and enjoy the nighttime t-shirt and swimming trunks weather while it lasted. I would say it was around 9 or 10 p.m., and we had gotten up to inspect his grandfather's old canoe that laid upside down atop the wooden dock, because we wanted to use it the next day to head to the lone island to look for loon nests and try to catch some catfish. As we walked to the dock from where we had been sitting, I gazed across the lake at Mount Kearsarge. The mountain has a height of 2,937 feet, or 895 meters, and a prominence of 2,080 feet, or 630 meters. So, since it was basically 2,000 feet straight up from our position, as we were only a couple of miles from its summit, it was quite an imposing figure in the night sky. Now the mountain has a tower on the peak that flashes a red light at night. There is only one light, and it is red. I had seen it many times before. It was just a fact, however, as I followed my friend to the dock, that I noticed there were more than 2 lights on this night. In addition to the usual red flashing light, there was a second, yellowish-orange orb to its right, essentially equidistant in height. It was not moving, flashing, pulsating, nothing. It just hung there, motionless in the night sky. I told my friend, who was immediately interested, and so we were both just stood there, transfixed for a while before he asked me what the hell I thought it was. I would have immediately considered a helicopter, but it was just so still and silent. After just a few moments of silent staring, we both shrugged our shoulders and continued down to the canoe at the end of the dock. We inspected it for a while, placing it in the lake to check for leaks, and decided that it was good to go. Which was exciting, as we were really looking forward to getting on the water. After lugging it back to the original resting position, I turned to my right and bent down to wash the cobwebs off my fingers in the lake. As I was doing this, I returned my gaze to the mountain, and to my amazement, there were now 2 identical orbs, one on either side of the red flashing light. I smacked my friend across the shoulder and told him to look up, and again, We just stared transfixed, albeit this time a little more anxiety-ridden. "What the hell?" my friend said, with a bit of fear creeping into his voice. Without averting our gaze, we backpedaled to our chairs and began discussing possibilities. It is important to note that both of us were science-believing realists, and still are to this day. We both accepted the distinct possibility that we, humanity, were most likely not alone in this never-ending galaxy, let alone the universe. Something. All the grains of sand on Earth. You know, the old Carl Sagan adage. So, as we sat, discussing both the Fermi paradox and the likelihood that it was just some sort of temporary, human-made thing going on top of the mountain, something happened. Before our eyes, one of the orbs slowly descended below the backside of the mountain and out of sight. I'm sorry, I know I am no aeronautical engineer or anything, but I know what a helicopter looks like when it descends in elevation. This was not like that at all. It sunk down and out of sight in less than just a few seconds, very smoothly, all without making any lateral movement whatsoever. We were stunned, but before we had time to wallow in this feeling or think that we could have possibly seen something unnatural, the other orb took off from its position. It did not gain or lose any elevation. It just took off horizontally at breakneck speed and began to make its way around the edge of the lake. It was not until the light was about halfway between its starting point and our position that we began to consider that it might be heading straight for us. We stood still at the shore and followed the objects with our eyes. Out of sheer curiosity, and without speaking, we both made an unconscious decision to wait and see what would happen. I mean, what else were we supposed to do? At no point did we talk or look at each other. We just stood there, watching. Without leaving you in suspense for too long, the object did eventually arrive to where we were, and upon its arrival, it slowed to a crawl and crept over us at a snail's pace. It was big. Not stereotypically mothership big, but big. I do not know exactly, but if I had to estimate, I would say it was about 50 meters in length by 30 meters in width. It was shaped like a fat cigar, and had 2 or 3 rows of orange lights on its bottom. I cannot tell you what my friend was doing or how he was reacting at this time, for I was entranced. I remember thinking that I had never had an opportunity to view something like this, and I probably would never get another chance again. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, so I stared intensely, examining anything and everything about it that I could. Unfortunately, there were not many details that I could make out, only its approximate dimensions and the rows of lights. It made no real sounds aside from what I perceived to be a very, very faint humming. There were no beams of light shooting down at us or anything like that. We stood in the pitch blackness of the late New Hampshire night, and I remember preparing myself for something to happen to us. But as far as I know, nothing ever did. As soon as it had crept its way past us, it took off as fast as it had appeared, up into the night sky and out of sight. At that point, I shot my head back across the lake towards the mountain. There was nothing but the normal, flashing red light remaining. All appeared to be back to normal. I do not think we said anything to each other aside from, "Let's get out of here," or something to that effect, before grabbing what little we had brought with us and hightailing it back to my friend's car. We drove the 30 miles back to our hometown, purchased some snacks at the convenience store, and returned to his house, where we proceeded to set up the same beach chairs that we had brought with us to the lake in his backyard, where we stayed up for most of the night, talking about what the hell we had just seen. For the next few weeks, my mind had hardly focused on anything else. I told my parents at some point, but they sort of just laughed it off, telling me that it must have been a helicopter or something like that. And after their reaction, I decided not to tell anyone else. Not until I was older and gave no crap about what people would think of me. It was only then that I began to tell my trusted friends about what happened that night. My friend and I have since parted ways. We live across an ocean from each other now and talk from time to time. In fact, it has been a few years since one of us brought it up. However, sitting here and writing this down, it just now made me want to reach out and talk with him again. I know what I saw, and it was not constructed by humanity. We do not have that sort of technology, at least, not that we know of. And if we do, there is far more hidden from the average citizen of the Earth than I thought possible. But I am digressing into conspiracy theories now, and that is a path that I try not to go down. The fact is that the possibility that we are alone in the universe is so microscopically small. Consider this. There are billions of planets out there that are much, much older than Earth. All it would take is one of them to have developed intelligent life a few million years before us, giving them a massive head start in the development and technology scheme that would allow them to create machines that could do what these objects are. Thank you for sharing my story, Swamp Dweller. I hope you enjoyed it. It was about late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8 years old. My father had the great idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was going to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, my father, and my mother to bond. So that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took off school on Friday to get a head start on getting there, which I had no issue with. We got there and it was sure cold. Well, it was almost December, so I guess it made sense that it was so cold. Anyway, we got all set up and decided where we would all sleep. We ate dinner, and then we all got set up for bed, and were thinking about what we would do tomorrow. We got there kind of late, so we couldn't do too much on the first day. That night, though, I heard noises outside. It sounded kind of like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing of note, so I figured it must have been an animal or something. I tried my very best to go back to sleep, and somewhere around 15 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, though, I made sure to wake my sister up. She was about 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it was best for it not to see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. But when we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast, and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for her breakfast. I walked outside and my father was talking to some man, a short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too for some reason. He was sweating a lot, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled and greeted him back. It may have been rude at the time, but I was just a kid. And I asked him, "You look kinda scared. Are you alright?" He kind of coughed and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just went through shell shock. I'm a veteran," he said, as I couldn't tell already with the cap he was wearing. He seemed rather normal at the time. My father seemed to really like this guy, and I liked him at first too. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family, and that they were really close to us, and he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast and he stayed, and it was seemingly normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My father was inside at the time, a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him, and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come to his cabin, because he had band-aids. I agreed and went with him. I wasn't a very smart kid. I went with Patrick. We talked about what I liked doing, and I told him about video games that I played and stuff like that. Then, things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. I didn't know what my shoe size was. I told him, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something along the lines of, "Good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired and there was no point in getting abandoned anymore, but I still decided to keep going since I had walked so long. We entered the cabin and he told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there. No family. I asked him where his family was and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear. He locked the door. I then kind of got frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with a band-aid, kiddo." He walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and he'd put it on. I sat down and he put it on me. He also held my leg in his other hand and rubbed it down and told me, "You're rather muscular, kid. I like that."
I got kinda scared and immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him nothing, and that my leg was feeling much better. I then thought my parents must be worried sick, and I should hurry back. He insisted that I stay longer and ate there. I didn't want to, but I was alone, and if I ran, I don't think I could have found my way back to the cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile across his face. He nodded and said, "Perfect weight." I asked him why it was perfect weight. He just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him if I could go. He said no, and that things were just getting started, and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was a closed door. Patrick stood up and looked kind of angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. I then heard him yelling, "Did I freaking tell you that you could move? No, so stay the hell where you are. I have company." Or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly. "Sorry about that. It was just my wife. She was really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today." He was smiling while saying that. I wanted to go. I then looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere, and it was really messy. He must have been living out of here. At that moment, his wife walked out of the room. "I'm hungry," she said. He looked pissed. "Get back in there," he said. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffling and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back in the room. I asked him where his kids were. He didn't answer. He told me he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on. That was the last straw. I had to get out of this situation, but I didn't know how to. I started crying and then he hugged me. He told me, "It'll be okay, little one. Nothing is going to happen. Just try on these clothes." He walked in the back room. I thought that was the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door and tried to leave as quietly as I could. I didn't care if I got lost anymore. I didn't want to take the chances with Patrick, if that was even his name. I had a feeling that he had been lying. He lied about having kids, who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear shouting. I heard him yelling stuff to his wife. Things along the lines of, "Where the F did I go?" and "I knew I shouldn't have left him alone." Stuff like that. I could have sworn I heard him call her a bunch of names that I don't want to repeat. Then, it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps. I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside and he seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for something. He then stepped out into the forest and I heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay, you can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes. I have toys in the back of my cabin. If you want to come play with them, just come back." I then ran. I ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes I would find my family. I was running away and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to hear it. Then, after about an hour of running, I saw a cabin. My cabin. I ran to it. My father was outside looking around for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy, and that he really was weird, and he was touching my legs and stuff. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, and he said that nobody had rented that cabin. My father looked at me and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day and asked for a refund for the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man, having the cabin rentals, called the police, and the police went back there and checked the cabin, and there was nobody there, not even his wife. His clothes and belongings were still there, is what they told us. Nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left. They never called us or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife, and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived in that cabin. He seemed to have been living there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would be coming after him because he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that will likely never get answered. I'm just glad that it's all over. Hi, Swamp Dweller. I do not know if you would be interested in a story from England. It is kind of long-winded and not overly scary, but it's a pretty weird experience that me and my partner would never forget. To set the scene, we live in a busy city in the South Midlands of England. We have a bully breed dog and take him out for walks in surrounding parks and woods quite often. I am quite into the paranormal and have experienced lots of things. My mom is a spiritual medium, so I guess it comes with the territory. My partner, however, is a science graduate and is a very everything has an explanation sort of person. Anyway, on this day we decided to go to a popular picnic park just on the outskirts of the city. It is almost always full of families, dog walkers, and picnickers. It was late spring and the temperature was just starting to hit summer heat. It was a sunny day, not a cloud in the sky and no wind. The park was full of the usual parents and kids and their family dogs, old couples going for walks and the like. Here in England, bully breeds are still quite stigmatized and feared, so we really avoid going where there are a lot of people. Not that our dog is dangerous or anything, he is just overly friendly and people freak out when he trots up to greet them. So we decided to go a bit off the beaten track. To give you a rough idea, the park has a small lake in the center, with paths and benches that surround it. Just off one of these paths are a few farmers' fields in a thick wooded area which snakes around into another path which eventually leads back to the park. We decided to go through the cattle gate which leads through the farmers' fields. It was so hot and beautiful that day that nothing spooky or creepy even crossed our minds. Even though you could no longer see anyone, you could still hear kids playing and dogs barking. As we came up to the wooded area, whilst on the dirt path alongside it, I noticed a man walking through the thick brush. I thought this was weird because he was coming from the opposite end of the woods, which literally leads to nothing. No houses or roads or anything. Just endless fields and woods as far as I know. I just told myself he must be looking for his dog or something. My partner noticed him too, and we shared a look at each other, like, what a weirdo, and carried on walking. But I could not help but look at him. He looked so strange. It must have been close to 30 degrees, and he was in a thick black hoodie, black trousers or sweats. He had longish, dirty blonde hair, and maybe was around our age, maybe mid-20s. But the weirdest fact is he had a dazed sort of smile on his face, and his head kind of tilted to one sidewinder. When he walked, he swayed from side to side slightly. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, and was telling myself that he was just a stoner or something looking for his dog. He was not calling or making noises to get a dog's attention though, or anything which was even stranger. Anyway, I kept looking back over my shoulder every couple of minutes. He was in the brush for a little while, but then joined the path we were on and began walking our way. He must have been about 30 feet behind us. I noticed how tall he was, because now that we were on the path I could pretty much size him up. He must have been about 6'9", maybe even 7 feet. He was huge, maybe like 17 or 18 stone, 240 to 250 pounds more or less. Around this point, we noticed everything went silent. There were no kids laughing, no indistinctive family chatter, no dogs barking, no birds tweeting, nothing. The only sound was the sound of our footsteps and wind, but there was no wind. It was roasting hot, not even a slight breeze yet. We could hear the wind blowing through the trees. Even though the sun was beating down, it felt darker somehow, like everything was, I don't know, desaturated. My partner started to freak out, and strangely, so did our dog. Now this really struck me as weird. Our boy is the kind of dog who would greet anyone, or run up to them to play. But no, he would not even look back at me or the man. My partner and dog started to speed up to get away from the wooded area and this weird behemoth of a man. I really started to freak out myself, but did not want to upset my partner even further, so I kept my cool, quiet, and kept my pace. I looked over my shoulder again and he was closer, maybe 25 feet away at this point. Now for a bit of context, as you exit the wooded area, you come to a path which is surrounded on either side with tall, thick bushes, and it curves around widely to lead you back to the main park. The curve is so wide that you can see far ahead, but you can only see the bushes where it curves, sort of thing. Neither of the exits are in view. As we reach this path, I check again, and the guy is even closer now. It is still silent. All I can hear is the faint wind sounds and our footsteps, but nothing from the man. He is still smiling in that dazed sort of way, and still kind of swaying. Everything still felt weird and dull. It's the only way I can describe it. And I thought to myself, if this weird bloke is going to try something, I'm going to have to protect my partner. I'm only 5'8" myself, and not much of a fighter, so I grabbed my car and house keys and put them between my fingers in my pocket. If this dude wanted to try anything, I'd smash him in the face and leg it. I'm not fast either, but I convinced myself I'd be faster than him. Just for a little bit of a reference though, don't put your keys in between your knuckles, you're just gonna break your hand. I check over my shoulder again and he is even closer still. I start to hype myself up. He was coming and I was ready. I realized I could not hear him at that moment though. He was probably about 15 feet behind me now. My partner and dog had literally hightailed it up the path, but why couldn't I hear the footsteps from them? Another quick glance and he was right behind me, not even 5 feet away now. This was it. If I was going to do anything, it had to be now. If I could keep the element of surprise on my side, I might stand a chance and give us the opportunity to run. I swung around as quickly as I could and went to shout at him and swipe, but he was gone. There was nothing there, no man and no sign of him whatsoever. I paused and looked around. He could not have run back along the path. He could not be that quick. I would still be able to see him as the path winds around so widely, he would still be in view. He could not have jumped through either side of the path into one of the rows of bushes, as I would have heard it and seen the rustling of the bushes or something like that. He had just vanished. I stayed there for a moment, and only when I decided to walk on to check on if my other half and my dog were okay, I realized I could hear the park again. The wind's noises had gone, and the day returned to normal. The sunlight was no longer dull, and everything seemed normal. I got shivers and ran to catch up. I asked my partner if they had seen him go anywhere, but they did not see anything. They just said he really freaked them out and they did not want to be there anymore. I could see that they were really shaken. The dog was back to normal though, wagging his tail and wanting to play and explore. We decided to cut our walk short and drive home. Shortly after we got home, I rang my mom and told her about it. She advised me to check reports for missing people or deaths related to the area, which I did, and weirdly, lots of people have died there by suicide or overdose. But none of the people I found online matched this person's description. I tried to forget about it and get back to normal life and all that. I was applying to go back to college at the time, so I did not really need to be thinking about giant ghost men. After a few days, it had left our minds and we got back to some sort of normality. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night and opened my eyes. As they adjust to the darkness, I look up at the ceiling where this orange glow of the street lamp shines through our window, and my heart stops. He was there, stood over our bed. He was so tall that his head was right below our ceiling light, and he still had that weird, dazed smile all lit up in the orange glow. I jump up and punch as hard as I can, but my fist does not meet anything, because there was nothing there. I turn on the light and look around. Nothing. I have never seen him since, but after seeing him in our bedroom, our apartment felt horrid afterwards. I never felt homey or safe, and we would hear horrible things. For example, at one point in the middle of the night, I heard my own voice call my partner's name from the other side of our bedroom door. We heard walking in our attic, which was too low for people to walk in, and our pets would not sleep alone. We left that flat after a year or so of dealing with that weird ghostly experience. My partner, of course, kept denying that it was ghostly, just that it could not be explained. There were other reasons for us leaving, like we wanted to expand and get ourselves a house and garden, but my main reason for leaving that area was because of that man. I have not seen him since, and I hope I never do again. We have now been in our new house for about a year and have not experienced anything strange. A few things have happened, but nothing scary or completely unexplainable. It has been about 2 years or so since this happened, and we both still refuse to go to that park. Daylight or not, I do have a few more freaky stories, so if you're interested, please let me know. Thanks for taking the time to read about our experience, and if anyone in England has witnessed something similar, I would love to know in the comments down below.
I was alone in my hot tub at around 11 p.m. behind my house. The woods surrounded my backyard, and there was no fence separating them. So when you are in the hot tub, you just face the woods about 100 feet away. I had the porch lights on, and I was just sitting on my phone when I heard a sound I had never heard before. It was a high-pitched, smooth, "hoo" sound. It was almost as if someone was singing the word "who," but with a very elongated, high-pitched "ooh" sound. It only lasted about 2 to 3 seconds, and I immediately froze and got goosebumps. I know you're not supposed to acknowledge stuff like that, so I called my brother and mom so they could come watch my back and help me get into the house. While I was on the phone, I heard it again. I didn't even want to get out of the hot tub. I have lived here my whole life and I've never heard anything like it. I have listened to various noises, coyotes, deer, owls, etc., and I've been researching different kinds of animal noises, but none of it matches. I'm hoping somebody in the chat has experienced something similar. This next story is something that happened a couple of weeks later. So, I've been hearing this creepy bird-like whistle since probably around 18 or whatnot, a little bit different from this other noise I mentioned. For context, like I said, we live in the countryside, and there's a sugarcane field on the other side of my house from where the woods are, and behind that field are more woods. The field was so wide, it was a bit far from our house. I don't know when exactly I started hearing it, but as long as I can remember, I heard this strange sound. I believe it started at 18. I'm 20 now, so it's been at least 2 years. At first, I tried to pay it no mind, but I noticed that I've been hearing it, honestly, more and more. And now that I've moved out and I've been in my apartment for some time, just so I can, get through college and whatnot, I began to hear it here. I even moved apartments, so now I'm in my second apartment. It's also near the woods, and now I'm still hearing it. It's located at the end of the street, and at one time, I went out alone to buy some snacks because I was pulling an all-nighter for my project. That's when I heard this weird whistle again, but this time closer than ever. I didn't want to overthink too much before, and I told myself that it might just be a bird. But when I heard it that night, it creeped me out. I think I heard it last February this year, and I'm still hearing it every time I go to the countryside. Should I be concerned? Or am I just being paranoid because of all these weird noises? A few years ago while in college, I worked the opening shift at a coffee shop that was nestled next to a thick set of woods. In the summer, I would wake up early, sometimes stopping by a trail on my way to work for a quick walk to wake myself up as the sun rose. Most people have probably heard the shave and haircut 2 bits jingle knock before. The trail, it was only accessible from a narrow, long winding dirt road, which branched off the main road with no houses or anybody living there. The trail was poorly marked and not very well maintained, so not many people would ever stop by. If there was anyone else, you would either see their car parked in the small 3-car gravel lot at the trailhead, or would have to pass them on the narrow dirt road. Otherwise, you would have to walk a long way down a main highway road to get there. So, back to the shave and a haircut bit. I parked there one morning just kind of sitting in my car with the window down when I heard a bird singing what sounded like 2 bits, part of the song. Tired and trying to find humor in having to be up so early, I kind of laughed and whistled, "Shave and a haircut," and what came back was the exact same thing. It was like it was responding to me directly. We went back and forth with our little game a few more times until the bird stopped responding. So I figured it just flew off or something. Before I got out of my car, though, I gave it one last whistle. And I'm sure glad I did, because as soon as I whistled "shave and a haircut" and waited for a response, I heard 2 very loud human claps in the 2 bits rhythm, not far from where I was parked. I drove the hell out of there as fast as I could, and I didn't see anyone on the road for miles. That might not be the most terrifying story you've ever shared on this channel, but it weirds me out to think that someone might have just been out there in the woods watching me alone in my car. So last night I'm having some brews with my homie. It's around 10:30. We head down to my local park. Typically during the day, we'd go to this trail behind the park that is open to the public. After hanging, talking, and just normal vibes, we had to go use the bathroom, so we decided let's go down the trail to the entrance where it's dark and enclosed so no one can see us. So we were walking, and as we were getting to the entrance area, we walked a little bit further into the trail, but still close enough to the entrance that we could see it. We felt a very typical vibe, laughing and continuing our drinking. I remember it being a little ominous when looking down a pitch-black path into a full trail completely surrounded by the forest. We didn't notice, but it was completely and utterly quiet, which was odd. Out of nowhere, my best friend and I heard this brushing noise like tree branches moving. We instantly looked down the path and exactly where it was coming from. It was as if some creature was darting towards us as fast as possible. I see the dirt from the trail being lifted into the air, and non-stop speeding steps coming toward us. I could hear everything, but it was hard to make out what it was. I was freaking out, thinking it might be either another person running towards us as fast as possible, or some kind of animal. I had no idea, but fight or flight kicked in, and my homie and I felt cornered and weirded out. It was non-stop running for us. In that instant, we turned around and we ran out of there as fast as possible. Now, maybe I'm just confused, but I'm from California, the Long Beach area. What animal randomly runs towards two humans like that? I couldn't tell you, especially that loudly on this little trail. I would think maybe it's a mountain lion, a bear, or something like that, but I feel like I would have saw the outline of something that big. Whatever it was, it absolutely terrified me, and if we would have stayed there for at least 10 more seconds, I don't think we'd be here today sharing this story. For context, I'm a 17-year-old female and I have lived in my house my entire life with my 2 other siblings and parents. My family and I live in this partly rural part of Fenton/Heartland, Michigan, and we've been here my whole life, like I said. We own 10 acres of land, which includes a pretty large track in our backyard that we ride 4-wheelers and such. The rest of it's untouched and just woods and trees. Every once in a great while, it seems that we hear some strange and very unnerving things when we go inside, though. A few years ago, my family took a walk out to look at our new neighbor's house, as they were gone for the weekend and said we were welcome to check things out. On our way down our quarter-mile gravel driveway, all of us heard what I can only describe as drums and chanting. It really freaked me and my brother out, because it seemed to be a fair distance away. Almost as if it had been coming from the woods in our backyard. There was a fair number of drumming sounds, and sometimes you would even hear chanting alongside it. It must have been pretty far away, but the sound still carried, which made it even creepier. I probably had this occur to me at least 2 or 3 times since we've lived here, and every time it's been unsettling and felt really wrong. We would be very aware if our town had any native tribes or reservations, but my small, conservative hometown would definitely not be the place to go to. I have searched high and low, but haven't been able to find anything on the internet in these areas that would even remotely explain what's going on, and it seems nobody else has the same experiences. If anybody listening to this has any idea what's going on, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. I'm awoken in the middle of the night to the sound of thumping and my dog Benjamin barking up a storm. Slowly getting up, I can hear my bones creaking. Age does that to anyone. Walking past a mirror, I stop to look at myself for a second and realize the years haven't been kind to me. Come on, Sawyer, I tell myself. Keep it moving. As I walk out into the living room of my cabin, I listen closely. Benjamin tailing close behind me. It's quiet now, save for the sound of the cold, snowy winds outside. I take a peek outside my window and see nothing, though I'll admit it's hard to see much out in this storm, and at this time of night. After a few minutes, I decide to walk back towards my bedroom and lay down again. The warmth of the blankets is welcoming and comforting. Winters are cold out here in the forest and mountains of Washington.
The warmth of the blankets makes an old soul like myself not want to get out. If you take me now, God, I'm quite sure I'd never know I died. That's the level of comfort we are speaking of here. Thump, thump, thump. Benjamin goes wild with his barking as I struggle to regain my bearings again. Looking around, I debate if I even want to get up this time. Quiet, boy, I tell Benjamin. It's probably just a storm anyhow. Get some rest. We got a long winter and not many places to be, my friend. It is with that, Benjamin and I drift off to sleep. Morning arises, and after much struggle, due to the aforementioned warmth of the blankets, I finally get up, get dressed, and decide to make some breakfast. Nothing quite like bacon, eggs, and hash browns to start the morning right. I'm pretty far out in the woods, but we do live close enough to a town that is only about an hour to an hour and a half away during the fall, and I stock up on plenty of food to go with meat I hunt as well. If there's one way I swear to never leave this earth, it's through starving. My gut is proof of that, I tell you what. I start up some coffee and decide to go out and survey how much snow has fallen since last night. According to the forecast, we were to have a slight lull during the day before snow impacts us hard again tonight. Looking around, I see I'll have to do some shoveling and clearing out around the cabin, but I figure I can do that after I get some food in me. I turn around and see Benjamin, who just finished his business, run up to me excitedly, tail wagging like the first day I pulled him from his mother, when he was just a wee little pup. Now, he's a huge Saint Bernard, and my most loyal and devoted friend. His mother passed a few years back, sadly, and the dog that impregnated her never really stuck around. I pet Benjamin, and as I do, I look over at the cabin. That's when I notice something odd. There appears to be some damage to my door. Walking over to examine the door more closely, it seems there are some broken and chipped pieces of wood, and a bit of indentation. That's strange. Could the storm have done this? I think on it for a moment, but decide ultimately I'll add reinforcing and repairing to my door to my to-do list, and for the day, move back inside with Benjamin to check on breakfast and the coffee that goes with it. Shutting the door behind us, I finish making my coffee a bit longer. Nothing quite like hot coffee on a cold winter morning. I drink it straight. It reminds me of living in a way. It can be bitter, but it's beautiful ultimately. Once I finish my coffee, I take the time to clean everything up, do my dishes, and then spend much of the rest of my day shoveling snow and repairing and reinforcing my door. I take breaks for the bathroom and to make and eat lunch, but by the time I'm through with it all, the sun is beginning to set. So I move inside, lock and bar the door behind me, and start up dinner. I'm cooking up some deer sausage from a kill I made a bit back. I figure deer sausage with some rice and beans isn't that bad. By the time I'm through, I can barely move from all the food I've eaten. Looking over at Benjamin, I see he seems quite content as well. I take him outside to go to the bathroom before locking up for the night. Turning off all the lights, I then head back to where it takes no time at all for the world to disappear around me.
Thump, 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 thump.
What the hell is that? Slowly, I force myself up before turning on some lights and heading for the noise. To my shock, the barricade on the door is cracked. The barricade is only made of wood, but it's a large piece of lumber. I make a point to add getting a metal bar for the barricade on my to-do list for tomorrow. There isn't any thumping at this point, but it's clear someone or something is trying to get inside my home. I grab my rifle, just in case, and peek through the windows. There doesn't appear to be anything. Granted, my windows aren't large enough for anyone to fit through. They're so small, I'm not so worried about any real sort of threat getting inside that way. The best way is through the front door, and something seems like it wants in. The rest of the night I sit in my chair, covered up, my rifle next to me, and pass out as best as I can. When I awake, it's morning. I'm guessing there was no more thumping, or maybe I was too tired to notice. I I prepped breakfast before taking the large piece of wood I slid in its slot as the barricade off and opened the door. I can't explain what I saw. My door is somewhat broken, and I decide I'll head to town today and get a proper barricade. Maybe even a steel door of some kind after I take care of the snow. It isn't supposed to snow again until tomorrow, so I do just that. Most of my day is spent getting much of the heavier door and replacing the frame and barricade. The door I have is steel, but it is painted in such a way to match the look of the cabin. It isn't perfect, but it'll do be far more secure. By the time I get home, I have just enough time to fix the door, replace the frame, and set it all up with my new barricade before making dinner and taking Benjamin out for his nightly business. As soon as that's over, I head straight to bed, barricading my door before I do. We'll get some sleep tonight, Benjamin. One way or another. We'll get some damn sleep because nothing is getting through that door. It is with that I pass out, blissfully unaware of the world around me. The next morning I awoke well rested and surprised to find I wasn't awoken by any real noise or banging on my door. Perhaps whatever animal had been doing it simply gave up after the first couple of nights. I did my normal routine of breakfast and soon after took Benjamin out for a walk after locking up. I let him do his business and we played a bit, enjoying the solitude and the beautiful view as we did. It was nice out here. Occasionally you'd get some wild animal aggressively trying to get into your home, but they were usually just hungry and often didn't pose a real threat. Sure, you get stories of people who come from their homes or wherever and there's like a boar or a bear or something that broke in and raided their fridge, but more often than not those people survive and don't experience such a thing again. At worst, they fix their doors, maybe get a weapon for it, and usually that is that. They live the rest of their lives in peace. I don't really blame an animal for wanting food, but generally, you aren't going to see a bear wandering around in winter. So I'm a bit perplexed in some manner as to what was big enough to mess up my previous door. I don't dwell on this though, cause it might just freak me out. I just continue to play with Benjamin for the rest of the day. We head back in that evening on account of the fact that it's supposed to snow again, and tonight, a winter storm is supposed to be here. Probably will be here for the next week or so. I figure that'll mean a lot of shoveling on my part, but I'm more than prepared for winter out here, seeing as I've been out here for most of my life. It's hard to believe I used to dwell more in the city when I was younger. I eventually got tired of that in society and decided to move out here around 25. Now, I'm 45, and well versed in living in the wilderness. My only regret is that I didn't take to doing this sooner. Life is peaceful out here, for the most part, I think to myself. It's quite nice, and you'll never have any real problems with people here. Walking inside my cabin, I lock up and barricade my door before making some dinner for myself and feeding Benjamin as well. I stay up after doing dishes and watching some television before finally turning out the lights around 10 and heading to bed.
Thump, thump, thump.
Benjamin, I think we have a guest again. What do you say we greet him? Benjamin shoots up already on edge from the thumping at the door, as I grab my rifle and head out towards the living room. I still don't see anything through my windows, and so I look out my peephole. It's dark and there doesn't appear to be anything there. As soon as I said that, I saw a large eye that took me by surprise and made me jump back for a minute. This was followed by another loud and persistent thumping on my door. Once I got over the initial surprise, I pounded back on my door, rifle in hand, and getting tired of being awoken in the middle of the night, I addressed whatever animal was out there. Listen here, I am tired and cranky, and I'm sick of waking up in the middle of the night. You can bang all you want, but you won't be getting through my door. There was a silence for a moment, and Benjamin was on edge as he waited to hear something back. After a few minutes, we thought maybe we'd scared the thing off. Still, to be safe, I waited for another hour. Nothing. Finally, we went back to bed and I passed out again. I shot up and ran for the door at the sound of a smashing and truck alarm blaring. I looked out the window, but couldn't see well through the snow. A few seconds go by when I suddenly see my truck flying towards the side of my cabin. I fell back before the truck impacted the side of the cabin. The cabin shook and Benjamin barked like mad as I scrambled to my feet and saw pieces of glass from my windows on the floor now. Holding up my rifle, I looked through the scope but saw nothing. I wanted to go out, but decided it was for the best not to. Whatever had destroyed my truck threw it with enough force that it hit the side of my cabin. I'd never encountered any sort of animal that could do such a thing. Based on the eye that I saw, I'd say whatever was out there couldn't be human at all. I quickly pulled out my phone and began dialing the cops. I was on the line when I heard a loud howling of some kind. The dispatch asked where I lived and what was happening, and all I could muster up was the courage to say to get over here, giving them my address along with that message, before hanging up. It took a few hours, but soon the sheriff arrived and knocked on my door. He asked what in the hell had happened, and I explained to him everything from the past few nights leading up to this moment. Perplexed, he had looked around and told me to stay put. I waited, rifle in hand, for his return. After a half hour or so, he returned and informed me that he wasn't sure what the hell was going on, but he'd take a report and come back in the morning when he could see better to check things out. He informed me that I should lock and barricade my door, and if I hear anything else out of the ordinary to call him. He then handed me a card with his number on it, and soon after left. I didn't sleep the remainder of the night, but I also never heard anything else outside either. Morning finally came, and true to his word, the sheriff returned and we both looked around the place more thoroughly. It was snowing like crazy and we didn't really find much. The sheriff reassured me, saying it's likely the snow covered up any tracks that was made, and that I should think about putting up some sort of security system or maybe some cameras that snap pictures at the first sight of movement. I agreed and soon after departed from the cabin. I spent the rest of the day making calls to my insurance company and arguing about how I had no clue what destroyed my truck. I also made some repairs to the side of my cabin, and after having my truck towed away, I soon pulled my four-wheeler out of the shed and headed to get some cameras. By the time I returned, the night was coming fast, so I installed and tested my cameras before having Benjamin go to the bathroom, and then I locked up my ATV in my shed and went inside my cabin. I made dinner and tried to relax as best as I could, but I was quite shaken from the previous night's events. I kept my rifle close to me at all times because now I was occasionally peeking out my peephole. I saw nothing and I barricaded my windows at this point in an attempt to keep the snow out. The night was long and very little sound had me up, checking my door every time. I was tired, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep just yet. I was sure whatever was out there would be back. If not tonight, tomorrow night. If not then, at some point down the road for sure. Sure as shit, I started to doze off when I heard a loud thumping at my door. I got up and slammed back once again. "Go away! If you don't, I'll shoot you myself!" There was a howling, followed by an even louder thud as I felt my floor shake. I held my rifle up at the door and waited as I heard two more thuds. This was followed by a loud howling before everything went silent again. The thought crossed my mind to call the sheriff again, but as things had fallen silent, I decided not to. I was scared for sure, but the thing had been able to get through my door yet, so I didn't feel like I needed to call him immediately. I wasn't in immediate danger just yet as long as that door stayed strong. It was about 4 in the morning, and so I made some coffee and waited for Benjamin for daylight to come. Once the sun crested over the mountains, and it was bright enough, I unlocked my door, and headed out with Benjamin to check out my door, also the cameras. The door seemed well, aside from an indentation. The frame seemed undamaged, and as such, I decided to immediately check the cameras next. Looking over the film, I was distraught. There were photos of something big. It looked about 9 feet tall. It had been throwing its shoulder into my door before leaving last night. I was in shock at the sight of this creature as it stood on 2 legs. But my cameras didn't get a good enough picture of it to tell what it really was. Walking in the direction of the creature, I tried to follow the tracks, but I was at a loss. So I decided to head back to town on my four-wheeler and pick up some more cameras for the cabin itself, and soon after returned, setting them up in places where I would get a much better view of the thing if I returned. After installing the cameras, I worked on the repair to the side of my cabin some more. It was coming along slowly, but it was definitely coming along well. Once again, night came. Benjamin and I headed inside, and I made some dinner for us both. After locking and barricading the door behind me, I hoped tonight, by some miracle of God himself, I'd hopefully get some real rest. To my surprise, I did just that. After heading to bed, I didn't hear a sound outside except for the snow. Once morning came, I felt refreshed and a little bit better. I received a call from the sheriff, who I informed I was okay still, before explaining I had done as he'd said with the cameras. I told him I caught something I didn't know how to explain on my cameras before having him over and showing him the photos myself. The sheriff suggested something odd to me. He said he didn't normally jump to such far-fetched conclusions, but he thought there was a chance it could be a Bigfoot. I laughed at the sheriff at first before I noticed he wasn't laughing at all. "You can't be serious, right, Sheriff?" The sheriff nodded at me, quite seriously, before telling me he'd seen some strange things in his time, and out in the woods of Washington, he'd investigated other claims of strange happenings in his long career. He said they'd gone unexplained, but he'd seen tracks before, and he was convinced Bigfoot existed. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't this time. "Well, what the hell am I supposed to do about this if you are right, Sheriff?" He shook his head, unsure of what to say, before putting his hand on my shoulders and telling me to install those other cameras, double-check my locks and reinforcements, and keep my gun close just in case. He left me with the words, "If this thing is aggressive as it seems, I'd need all the help I could get." He offered to stick around for the night, and I almost declined before thinking I'd be better safe rather than sorry, right? The next couple of nights went by quickly. I slept and not a thing had happened. It didn't return. It was nearing the end of the week and the snow was finally beginning to let up, and when I shook the sheriff's hand and told him thank you before he finally went on his own way, he said if anything happened again, feel free to call him, and he'd head this way. We'd work on the cabin over the past couple of days, and had just about fully repaired the side, and we almost replaced the windows. I was feeling slightly more relaxed as I hadn't seen the creature in about 3 nights or so. That relaxation lasted as long as it took me to check the cameras. It seemed the last few nights, the sheriff and I had not been alone as we believed ourselves to be. On the cameras, I saw the thing still not very clearly several times. In some of the photos, it simply sat and waited, observing the cabin. In others, it looked inside the windows of the sheriff's vehicle before slinking back into the trees, waiting. At one point, a time for which I'm sure we're both still awake and talking, you could see the creature listening in, its ears pressed to the door. I never got a completely clear shot, however, and so I didn't have definitive proof of what it looked like. My first thought was to call the sheriff back, but upon further reflection, I decided against it. This thing was intelligent. It was waiting for me to be alone again. It knew I wasn't, so it didn't attack any of those nights. If I was going to lure it out again, and at the very least get a better shot of it, I need to stay alone until it came out to see me. So that's what I did. I made a real meal, and soon hit the bed early. I waited quietly, hoping to hear the thing again. I had locked my door and barricaded my camera. I made sure it was running. I was prepared to find proof of the thing that stalked me. I had a feeling I'd do just that. With enough patience, at some point late in the night, I must have drifted off because before I knew it, the morning was upon me again. Waking up, I went to the kitchen to make breakfast and noticed it was still snowing. I checked the weather, which seemed to indicate there was another system that had developed overnight and had heavier snowfall, and that we would be stuck here in the snow longer than anticipated. Thinking nothing of this, I ate breakfast and headed out to check the cameras with Benjamin happily running alongside me. It was only now I realized a problem. The cameras were no longer there. I found them destroyed, all over the yard. Any film I recovered only showed black or nothing on it at all but snow. It was almost as if this thing had spotted the cameras, avoided them, and soon after destroyed them one by one, leaving the husk of the cameras behind as a message. That's not what happened though, right? I mean, there's no way that Bigfoot or whatever the hell this thing is was that intelligent, right? I tried to shake off the thought before going inside and calling the sheriff. It didn't take long for him to arrive and we discussed what had happened. I'm at a loss, Sheriff. I'm not sure what to do now. If I get more cameras, this thing might just destroy them again. I mean, I don't know if it can climb, or what it can do, or what it's capable of, or what it's not incapable of. If I have you or anyone stay nearby, it likely won't show up again. You can't stick around forever, though. What do you think? The sheriff seemed every bit amiss at a loss as I was. He was confused and unsure of what to try next, but he agreed. Getting another camera would likely be a waste of money. Perplexed by the intelligence of this thing, the sheriff said to call him if I noticed anything else odd or if the thing attacked again. Soon after he drove away, looking every bit as confused as I felt. What was I going to do? There was no way I could simply ignore this thing. There was no way I could do anything to catch it in the act. I had never felt so hopeless in my entire life as I did at this point in time. Deciding not to get too down on myself, as it wouldn't help my situation anyways, I went about my day shoveling snow and chopping some firewood before ending the day playing with Benjamin and trying to stay relaxed. I knew panicking wasn't going to help me or anything, and at this point, I needed all my wits about me every night until this was over. Locking things up, I ate some dinner and spent the rest of the night watching some movies and trying to relax as much as possible. To my surprise, I awoke to find it was 9 in the morning. I'd woken much later than usual and found Benjamin licking me and trying to get me outside probably so he could go to the bathroom. I got up and let Benjamin do his business before looking around the property. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I checked my shed. The lock had been broken off and my four-wheeler was missing. Shit, I thought to myself. This thing wanted me stranded completely. I wasn't too worried. I had plenty of food to make it through the winter, but the thought that I was stranded did leave me with some sense of unease. I searched for my vehicle for quite some time before finally finding it an hour away, wrapped around a tree, down a steep drop-off. Heading back home, I called the sheriff and explained to him what had happened. I insisted he didn't stick around, however, as the only way this Bigfoot was going to show itself, if that even what it was if I was alone. With no more than my dog. He said he wouldn't stay, but I need to show him where my four-wheeler was found. So I did, and the remainder of my day was spent with him examining the damage and making a report before leaving. This was insane, I thought to myself, when I finally settled in for the night at my cabin. I had an uneasy feeling as I went to bed. Something didn't feel right about tonight. It wasn't just that this thing was slowly making moves to isolate me. It was also that it seemed to know I had nowhere else to go. It was though it had chosen me off of the basis that it knew I didn't have anyone else to stay with or live with. How long had this thing been watching me? Had it been days, weeks, months? I hesitated to think the last part, but had it been years? Whatever the case may be, it knew exactly when to come out so it wouldn't be seen. It was highly intelligent, and I was out of options other than to wait for it to try to enter my home again and deal with it accordingly. I pondered what I'd do if that happened until, finally, I drifted off to sleep. Thump, 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 thump. The banging was louder than ever, and I shot up out of bed. Running for my phone, I immediately called the sheriff. The phone rang as I did. I could see the steel bending on my barricade.
Hello? Sawyer? Are you there, Sawyer? Sawyer, is that your dog? Sawyer?
Update. It was in half an hour or so before I arrived at the cabin. There was blood and the sight of a mangled steel door in the floor. Looking around, I noticed the foam was ripped out of the wall in pieces. Walking further into the cabin, the lights were dead and it was in the back room. Amongst other destroyed doors, I found Sawyer, gun clutched to his chest, terrified. It took a bit of persuasion, but I finally got Sawyer to hand me the gun, and I soon called up the crime scene and brought him down to the station. After giving him some cocoa and giving him some time to come down from the shock, he explained to me that he awoke to the sound of violent banging. He then explained how he tried to call me, but as soon as he dialed, his door was beginning to give away, so he headed for it. After much struggling, he backed off when he realized the door was going to fall. He didn't want to be crushed by it, so as soon as the thing entered his home, his dog Benjamin jumped at it, and bit at it before being thrown off, getting up and barking again. He said he emptied every bullet he had into the thing as it ripped the phone out of the wall and crushed it. I stopped Sawyer and asked if he killed the thing. He said he grabbed the gun he had his backup in his case and emptied every shell he could into it, but it only howled, turned away, and ran off into the night. Sawyer seemed quite convinced the stalker was alive and well. We staged a few more stakeouts and I left him alone, per his wishes, for several nights after. Nights turned into weeks, which turned into months, and there was never a word or another harassment from this thing again. Sawyer and I became friends, bonded by our involvement in this case. He still says he has PTSD to this day from the events. But since repaired his cabin, completely lives alone and in the same spot. Although he fears his attacker, he refuses to move. We are still friends to this day.
Last year at the beginning of summer, I visited my Nana's farm with my mom for just a weekend. Her farm is located in a very rural and secluded area, right at the foot of a mountain in a rural area of South Carolina. The roads in my area are poorly maintained and barely wide enough for two cars to pass by each other. The houses are spread out and pretty far back into the tree line from the road, so there is very little ambient light besides a car's headlights in the distance. So, my mom and I were driving along, her in the driver's seat and me in the passenger. It was around 11 p.m. and we were about 15 minutes away from Nana's, deep in the woods with the radio down, almost silent. We come onto this straight stretch of road in a heavily wooded area, and suddenly, this blur of a creature darts out across the road, right at the edge of our headlights. It was moving incredibly fast, but my mom and I got a really good look at it, and both of us agreed at what we saw. It was a reasonably large creature, roughly the size of a person, maybe just a bit bigger. Neither of us could make out the shape of the head, but we both remember it appearing to have a segmented body, as if it were emaciated and its ribcage were poking out. The reflection of a light made it hard for me to tell the color, but my mom said she remembered it to be dark, and she didn't see any fur or hair. It had long, gangly limbs as it moved across the road. It didn't run the way a dog or a horse would with all four legs. The best word to describe it would be that it was loping, using its front limbs to pull itself along and moving considerably fast. We both said something along the lines of, "What the heck is that?" as it crossed in front of us. As we got up to where it had crossed, I turned to look at it, and as we reached the other side of the road, where it was just out of our headlights, I looked, and I swear on my life, it stood up and it ran. Not like a dog, but like a person, as if it were bipedal. I immediately yelled that it had stood up, and we both started getting nervous. I honestly would have thought that I was going insane had another person in the car not seen it with me. My mom has always been a pretty level-headed person, and not superstitious in any circumstance, but she was incredibly nervous and was pretty scared about this, and we had to agree not to tell Nana about this to avoid scaring her. I recently came across an article about a woman who was hunting and claimed to have seen an invisible or cloaked creature that she likened to the Predator from the movie of the same name. I read her story and saw the picture she took of the supposed predator. Regarding the picture, I believe it may be a result of a sun flare and a close-up of her face. However, I am not dismissing her story. In fact, I'm quite doing the opposite, as I also have had a similar encounter that led me to seek out if anybody else has experienced this predator-type creature in the woods. Now, on to my encounter. When I was around 5 years old, I used to play near the woods behind my grandmother's house. I played there frequently, and my grandmother would keep an eye on me from the kitchen or living room, as the house had large windows facing the woods. Every now and then, she would come out and check on what I was doing. I was really into digging in the dirt and collecting unusual rocks and arrowheads scattered around the area where my grandmother lived. This is Midwest Illinois, not far from Cahokia Mounds, so finding arrowheads was not super uncommon. Anyway, that day I remember picking out a spot to dig. I'd been out there for quite some time because I remember I had a decent sized hole going when something caught my eye in the tree I was next to. I don't really know how to explain it, but it looked like a heat wave coming off the branch. It was fall. I remember this because I had my pink jacket on, and I remember thinking that my mom was going to be pissed that I had dirt around the bottom of my arms from digging. I also remember there being a lot of leaves on the ground. Anyway, I am staring at this quote-unquote heat wave and realizing it was somewhat of a human shape. So here I am, 5 years old, and wondering why an invisible man is in the tree. I remember feeling scared but unsure what to do. Then it started moving and making a faint clicking sound. That is when I decided I was not supposed to see this and hightailed it back to the house. My grandmother saw I was pretty shaken, and I remember telling her I had just seen an angel. In my 5-year-old mind, I didn't know what else it could be. I had never seen aliens, heard of ghosts, or monsters at this point. So it really had to be an angel, because that's all my little mind could think of. Fast forward to when I'm about 12 years old or so. By this time, the encounter was way out of my mind. I loved watching action and sci-fi movies. My dad rented a movie called Predator. I'm watching it with him, and the first time you see the Predator invisible/cloaked, I about crapped myself. All the memories from that day, digging in the dirt, came flooding back. I even asked my dad if the Predator was real or not, and if anybody had known any animal that could do something like that. He wasn't really sure, but he told me the Predator thing was definitely fake. It wasn't like today where we could just Google it and figure it all out, you know? I had no access to the internet. So again, I just put it out of my mind. Fast forward to about the year of 2004. I'm grown, have 3 small children, and just went through a separation from my husband. I moved to the next town over to an apartment with my kids. These apartments are all 1-level duplexes and 5 buildings. I am at the very last apartment in the previous building. The apartments are considered in town, but they're more on the outskirts. A deep ditch runs behind the buildings. A chain-link fence separates them from this massive set of woods. There's about 6 or 7 trees on the side of our wall. If you follow the ditch a little bit, you'll hit this small forest that eventually leads to a country road with a bunch of extensive farmland and a bunch more forest and whatnot. I am a smoker, but I would not smoke in the apartment because of the kids, so I often went out onto the back porch. One night I was up late doing laundry and stuff after the kids went to bed. I decided to go outside and take a smoke break before I went to sleep. I am back on the porch and started hearing this faint clicking sound. I immediately looked to the ditch because I had seen a groundhog there a few days before. I thought perhaps it was there again. The backyard is dimly illuminated by the nearby playground light to the right of the back porch. I only turned on my porch light when I went out for a quick smoke. I didn't see a groundhog or any movement from the ditch, so I went back to smoking my cigarette. The faint clicking sound kept happening, and a slight movement made me look up into the tree to the left of my porch. Something was there. I didn't see a groundhog or anything like that, but what I did see was vaguely in the shape of a humanoid. It had to have been the same thing that I saw when I was 5. It gave off that same distortion. It was crouched down on the branch with one arm out, holding on to the tree trunk. I couldn't believe it. Is this really happening, is all I could think to myself. Has it come to kill me from seeing it all those years ago? All I could think was about my kids and everybody sleeping in the apartment. I ran inside and slammed the door, locking it immediately. I ran to my kids' rooms and closed all their windows and locked those as well. Then I turned off all the lights in the living room and stared out the blinds at the tree to see if I could catch another glimpse of it. I sat there for what had to be about 10 minutes, maybe even more, and I never saw another thing. I began to think maybe I was just tired, maybe I was just hallucinating it. And just as I was finally talking myself down, my neighbor's dog came running across the yard and started barking at the tree at the same branch where I had seen this predator thing. That freaked me out even more, because that dog was not a barker, and now it kind of reassured what I had just seen. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I have never seen anything like it again, and I don't know if I ever want to. Does anybody listening to this have any idea what it could be? I had a really strange experience last winter at Congaree National Park, just outside of Columbia. It's a beautiful boardwalk that winds through the swamps and cypress forest. If you look at the image, the story might make more sense. I used to live in Columbia, South Carolina, and I often visited the Congaree National Park, also known as the CNP, so I know the area fairly well. I would frequently hop on the fence and walk along the boardwalk at night. It was incredibly peaceful to stroll through the swamp and listen to the sounds of wildlife. There was never a ranger or a guard present after hours, so I was always alone. I went for a walk in October of 2021 with a flashlight. There were lots of insects and frogs making noise, but it suddenly stopped when I was about a mile in. I heard what I thought was my wife call me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there with me. I was alone, and she was out of town. I then heard water sloshing to my right and saw nothing. I chalked it up to being tired and kept on moving. The wildlife started up shortly, and everything seemed to be fine again. Probably about 15 minutes later, I noticed that it got eerily quiet again, and I heard swamp water sloshing to my left one more time. But this time, it was much more deliberate, almost like somebody walking with purpose. I was in a thick portion of the cypress and couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of me at my best, and then I heard my wife's voice again. Again, she wasn't with me. She was out of town, certainly not moving through a swamp at 1 a.m. I saw what looked like a human silhouette move between the trees for a split second, but it was off. Very skinny, pale, and taller than me at 6 foot. I noped the hell out of there really quickly, and ran almost the 2 miles back to my truck and didn't slow down until I heard the wildlife again. Like I said, this is a boardwalk that's in a swamp in the boonies. Nobody is walking around in the dead of night like I am. I'm probably the weirdest person around here. At least, I think so. I feel like I should add that I wasn't high or sleep deprived. I just like going in the woods at night. I was so freaked out by this, I came to the show and had to submit it 100% immediately because I wanted you to hear it. I'm convinced that I have encountered some sort of crawler or wendigo or something else that can mimic voices. Growing up on a small farm bordering a forest in Tennessee, I experienced numerous unexplainable events, but one series of occurrences remains a mystery to this day. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, I began having reoccurring dreams that took place in a forest, a location I often visited. In these dreams, I would come across a large black wolf with glowing red eyes. Strangely, each time I saw this wolf, there would be a death on the farm within a day or two, usually involving a chicken being preyed upon by a predator. During my final dream involving the wolf, a woman's voice accompanied its presence in the forest. I could hear her, but she always remained just out of my line of sight, though Her words are now hazy in my memory. I recall her saying,
"Do not fear the wolf,"
among other things. As the wolf circled me, I didn't feel fear, but rather a deep sense of respect for its ancient power. After that last encounter, I never saw the wolf again, but the dreams felt more vivid than reality. Since then, I've wondered about the identity of the wolf and the woman in the forest. These dreams marked the beginning of my fascination with the paranormal, leading to many more inexplicable experiences. I've often wondered if I connected with a forest spirit or a Native American presence during these encounters.
So I told my story of what I thought was a Dogman encounter on this channel a while back. Well, in that video, I stated that I had many weird and crazy stories. Since you graciously shared the last one, I thought why not share another scary encounter I had. As I said in the last video, I lived in Maryland, but before you think of blue crabs and beaches, I'm in a more rural area of the state. My uncle and aunt own a condo, however, at a popular beach cut Ocean City. In late May of 2018, I decided to take my friend Omar to the condo since no one was using it, and I got permission to take the keys and go. It's about a 3-hour drive from my home to Ocean City, and since I was a newer good driver and recently got my provisional license, I decided to drive up for a vacation with my best friend. I own an old black 1970 Chevy Nova, but it is fast as a Roadrunner and very reliable. I, extremely hyping up with my new car, decided to purchase a roll cage, which would come into play later in the story. I was told it was stupid and costly, but my family eventually admitted how badass my car looked. Plus, very safe. So on May 28th, I drove my Nova to Omar's house about 5 miles away from mine, and we set off. Depending on which way you go to Ocean City, much of the drive is through farmland and small towns near the Potomac River. We were about 2 hours into the drive, and since it was still midday, we were not pressed for time, seeming how we would be there for about 2 weeks. As Omar snacked on chips loudly, he asked if we could shuffle some music on his phone. My phone was charging on a portable charger in my hoodie pocket, and the speaker was rolling at my feet. Since it was a vintage car, I didn't remove the old speakers or anything, just the stuff I needed since, I needed to fit in the roll cage. I said of course because I and Omar share the same taste in rap music. I picked up the speaker and he connected it via Bluetooth with his phone. Now, since I had a loud engine in the car, the speaker was equally loud to balance out the noise. Omar, of course, blasted the speaker to its max, but I wasn't complaining because the song went hard. While I was too busy rapping to the loud lyrics, I failed to notice the deer standing in the center of the street. Omar yelled for me to swerve, which I did, but as my rear bumper clipped the deer, my car flipped into the air, doing a full corkscrew and landed, sliding on its hood for 12 feet or so. We hung there by our seatbelts in shock, not fully comprehending the insanity of what just unfolded. I had busted my nose and scratched my face pretty bad, and Omar banged his forehead on the dash, but besides that, I'm pretty sure we were all ultimately fine. I looked over at Omar as he looked at me, and we just laughed. Partly because we lived, and mostly because we were in the weird state of nervous shock. It took a minute to compose ourselves, and still strapped in hanging upside down, we began to realize that a damn deer had flipped my car. We somehow got out of my door, crawling painfully through the window, which was shattered all to hell. As Omar stepped out, he met my gaze. I was looking at the same deer standing looking at us as if we had broken a twig. Omar's jaw dropped, as did mine. Maybe it's some metal statue some guy left out as a prank or something, Omar said. But as he did, the deer blinked. Thoroughly freaked out, we started back towards the car, making sure not to break eye contact with the thing. As my thigh bumped into the car, the deer stood up on his back legs and let out a scream that made my head hurt. Omar and I began to run, but knowing we had nowhere to run, we stumbled to the front of my car. But the thing was gone. Out of nowhere, it seemingly just vanished. Our hearts pounding, we tried in vain to flip my precious car. Thankfully, the roll cage I'd invested in not only saved our lives, but most of my car as well. Since flipping it wouldn't work, Omar had a great idea. Call Marco. Our friend Leo's uncle had a towing service, also working in insurance. Remembering the pain that it took to get a company to insure a teen driver like me, I quickly dialed Mr. Romani. He picked up instantly and greeted me like a brother. I shared him our situation, and where the last gas station I saw was, leaving out the detail of a deer creature and replacing it with a hit-and-run driver. His employees were all off, but he told me he could drive us and pick up the car. He took us to the beach and took the car back. I quickly thanked him and asked him to hurry, thinking the beast might still be close. He hung up and we sat back to back on the side of the road. We waited, and it felt like we waited for a very long time. But it only luckily took him about an hour to get to us, because he lived closer to Ocean City than we did. He flipped the car using his truck and tools, and then loaded it on his truck. We hopped in and thanked him. He told me and Omar the car would be fine in his hands, and if we saw the car on the road that flipped us, to point it out. I and Omar glanced at one another and I said I would. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We spent our 2 weeks on the beach and boardwalk, and on our second to last day I got a call from Marco saying all was in order and the car was ready to be dropped off at the condo tomorrow. I told Omar the news and we all breathed a sigh of relief. As the amazing person he was, the work it took to repair my car was cost-free. I thanked him and we hung up. On the drive back, I made sure to take a different route home, while Omar looked up possible explanations of what could have happened. We were so caught up in the joys of vacation that we had barely mentioned it to each other. He found stories of things called skinwalkers, which would manifest and take the shape of creatures. I drove my car much more carefully on the way back, and got us home safely. Although for about 2 weeks after that there was always a tapping noise on my window. I could have sworn that I heard a voice that sounded like a bad imitation of Omar's voice, whispering as a lure to get me outside. I knew whatever was outside was not my best friend. Some backstory. This was 2 days ago. My family owns about 80 acres of land, and we lease it to my grandfather for his cattle since he has so many. He has about 3 farms that he owns personally, but he needed more space to put his other 20 head of cattle. Now, I'm getting to my story. My grandfather called me at around 8:56 at night, saying that he had lost track of one of the newborn calves and he needed my help. We meet at the old bunkhouse on our property. He said we should split up and search the land, and we took off with our four-wheelers. I drove around the upper, more forested area of the place. I came around, and the sun had finally set. It was dark now, so I turned on my lights and drove through the trees. I kept searching for the calf, but I couldn't find it. I stopped my four-wheeler and it was quiet. I pulled out my flashlight and decided to look on foot for a minute. I walked a little bit away from my 4x4 and I heard some light rustling. It was so quiet that I didn't know if I actually heard it or not. I slowly turned my head in the direction and slowly shined my light there. And there it was, the calf. But it was in the lap of, well, something. I can only describe what it looked like because I have no words to name this thing. It was sitting there with the calf in its lap. It had one hand on its back and one in its stomach. Its eyes were huge and it had no pupils. Its head was a skeleton shape, but it was like wrapped in tight skin. You could see the skull inside of its head. Its nose was 2 holes below where they should be. It looked like it didn't even have a mouth, just smooth skin. But there was blood covering the spot where a mouth should have been. We sat there staring at each other for at least 5 minutes. Then, that's when it started opening its mouth, slowly, and its head rolled back. It opened its mouth wide and bent down to its neck. Its teeth were filed and they all curved back towards the throat. It didn't have a tongue, and you could see down its throat. It didn't scream or yell or anything really. It just quietly kind of screeched, and then slowly came back to the state that it was before. I forgot to mention that it was as tall as me sitting. It pulled its hand out of the calf and started standing slowly. I forgot to mention its hands weren't exactly big, but they were long. Its fingers didn't have fingernails, but instead the fingers were sharp points. When it finally stood all the way up, it was an estimated 10 feet tall, and I was about a solid 6 foot. It took a step forward, and I finally snapped out of it. I turned and sprinted to the 4x4. As I ran, I looked back and it was following me. But it seemed like it was saying something to me, like it wanted me to stop. And as I thought that, it took 2 strides and it was only 5 feet away from me. I hopped on the 4x4 and was trying to get it to start. I looked back and it was looking down at me. Its sharp claws were coming towards me slowly, as if it were trying to console me while I grieved at a funeral. I started it and took off, and while I was driving over the roar of the engine, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I left the tree line, and I rode down the hill, and stopped and looked up. It was there looking at me, still the same abstract look on its face. It just walked back into the woods. The day after I came back to that spot I saw it the day before, there was a trail of blood that led to a field in the back of the property, and all that was left of the calf was some bones with a little meat in the pile. Right next to it was its skin. I was going to bury it, but I had forgotten to bring a shovel. I left and went to get one, but when I came back, the pelt was hanging from the wall in the bunkhouse. I looked upon the hill, and it was watching me. Last night, when it was really quiet, and I was close to being asleep, I heard some twigs snapping outside my house. I looked out the window from the blinds and I saw a pair of white eyes staring back at me.
I was tree planting near Smithers, British Columbia, about an hour and a half into the mountains on dirt roads. I tried my best to forget this incident ever occurred, as I simply could not find a way to rationalize what had happened. By the way, I don't really care who believes me or not. This happened to me, and I know it did. It was almost midnight, and I was trying to sleep in my tent. My tent was near a bunch of standing dead trees that would creak when the wind picked up. A loud and distinct sound, something you could never forget. On this particular night, it was dead silent and still. I started to hear sticks cracking and steps being taken that slowly got closer over the 15 minutes. It was loud enough that I was sure a bear was approaching my tent. It got so close that it had been no further than 15 feet from me. It was cracking sticks and batting around the forest floor. I decided to yell out very loudly, and silence was all that I got in return. There was no sound of the creature fleeing or doing anything at all. I sat in silence, too scared to move, trying to rationalize to no conclusion. About 20 minutes of dead silence later, I heard the eeriest, unnatural, and unexplainable noise. It had the same timbre, volume, and sound as the trees outside creaking, but instead of being a regular creak, it began to then be held out as the same note of a scratching sound for 5 seconds or even longer. It was like an unnatural drone that was not a tree creaking or a twig snapping. It was something trying to mimic it. There was no hint of wind or any other trees creaking as usual. For the rest of the night, I barely slept, and the next day was tough as I was incredibly tired on my hike. I tried my best to forget about it. I didn't even make the connection that skinwalkers are known to imitate sounds until just a few weeks ago. This all happened in July of 2022. I'd love to hear if anybody has had a similar experience or has any ideas what this could have been. I had an encounter in February 2007. I used to work the third shift at a paper stock factory warehouse. The primary day shift supervisor was on vacation, so our boss on the night shift decided she wanted to leave early. She let us sneak off about 2 hours earlier than our average shift time, which would end somewhere between 4:30 and 5 a.m. I was following a coworker down a county road, as the warehouse was on the outskirts of my small, rural town. I noticed he hit his brakes and proceeded to swerve off the road. I was probably about 1,000 feet behind him, and I thought to myself, what the heck is this dude doing? And that's when I saw it. I saw a tall, dark figure walking down the middle of the road, hunched over and swaying from side to side. It moved in an unnatural way, similar to one of those tall, inflatable figures you see swaying at a car dealership. It's hard to describe accurately, but it's something that would make more sense if you saw it for yourself. I saw what looked like a tall person wrapped in a large, dark blanket or cloak. I had to hit the brakes and swerve, but I stopped completely. I couldn't make out any features or characteristics. I saw a large torso with 2 legs. The upper half was hunched forward, leaning like an older person would if they had like a walker or something to assist them. At the time, I was driving a 1998 Ford Explorer, and I looked up the vehicle's height. It's listed as about 67 inches, but whatever walked past my driver's window that day was a good foot or so higher than that, leaning forward, so I believe whatever was walking was over 7 foot tall at a minimum. I couldn't see his head or arms, just a figure with legs walking. My taillights illuminated it as I started to drive past it. I couldn't give you any real definite details about the body. I didn't see fur, skin, or anything like that. It was solid, not like a translucent type of thing. It was enormous, thick black, and maybe very dark gray. My coworker had pulled into a parking lot a few miles down the road, and I followed him in. You could tell that he was scared. He said something like, "What the heck was that? It didn't look like I have a head," among many other things most panicked people would say. We decided to drive back down and see if it was still there. I went in front, and he followed behind me. We approached the general area, and I noticed a large black animal lying in the middle of the road. It appeared to be a big black dog. Part of me knew it wasn't large enough to be what it was before, but I was still too scared to stop because it was in the middle of the roadway. I didn't really have a choice, though. I decided to get out and walk up to it. All the while, my coworker was yelling at me to get back in my car. As I approached whatever it was lying in the road, it raises its head and looked back at me, its eyes glowing yellow, which I write off as eye shine from the headlights. But it growls at me, so I stop dead in my tracks and just start watching it. This thing stands up on its back legs like a person would, but it falls back down. It sits back up and hobbles off to the side of the road like a wounded animal that couldn't use its front legs. It almost looked like your typical German Shepherd wolf-type face, but its fur was puffy like a chow dog. It was a lot bigger than most dogs I've ever seen, but still nowhere as tall as whatever was walking down the road before. I didn't see any blood or wounds, so I can't say if it was actually hurt or not. We got back in our car and drove off. Honestly, I'm pretty traumatized, and I've been doing my best to rationalize this experience. The thing that doesn't make any sense, though, is what was going on and what did I stumble upon? Did I find another creature attacking one? Did I see something that got hit by a car and maybe the other creature was checking it out? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
When I was younger, I preferred to spend time at my great-grandmother's house rather than my own. Being right next door, my grandmother would often let me spend the night with my great-grandparents to get me out of her hair. My grandparents had their own bedroom on one end of the house, and on the other end was the room which I slept in whenever I visited. This bedroom was big to a 6 or 7-year-old, with a large bed that had sliding glass door cabinets for a headboard, and 2 large windows, one of which had a crate of toys for it, mostly building blocks and the like, that faced the side yard, which had several young pine trees. The other window faced a large barn out back that housed their camper and all manners of other things. Before I continue, I ought to mention that I'm a quarter Native American, of the Miami tribe, to be specific. My mother was adopted by a family whose heritage was distinctly French. While my grandmother wanted my mother and I to have nothing to do with our heritage, my great-grandmother embraced it, but never kept it from us, and even taught us a little bit about it. Me far less than my mother, since I was way too young to understand much before she passed. One night when I was sleeping over at my great-grandma's house, I woke up when the motion-detecting floodlight on the barn out the back turned on. The room was flooded with light, and I could see everything was clear. Unable to go back to sleep, I got up and decided to play with the blocks until the floodlight went out, and I could go back to sleep. For some reason, I felt the strange urge to look out the window into the side yard, so I climbed up on the crate under the window and peered out. There, in the side yard, was a man. He was in his late teens, 17 to 19, with neatly cut straight black hair, nearly ear length. He wasn't dark-skinned, but he wasn't white either. He wore what looked like tan Carhartt overalls and appeared to be examining a young pine tree not 15 feet from the window. The tree wasn't very tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, but the young man was carefully moving the bottom branches this way and that, as if looking for something. I watched him for a minute or two, simply observing. I didn't feel frightened. Rather, I was curious. Then the young man lifted his head and looked around. When he saw me, the strangest thing happened. He looked startled, almost terrified. His eyes widened so far that I could make out their whites in the low light. There's no other way to explain what occurred after that, other than the crazy sounding. He turned into a deer and bolted away into the darkness. He simply turned to his left, dropped to all fours, and was a deer by the time that he would have hit his hands on the ground. He ran off, beyond the barn, where I couldn't see. I don't remember the conversation I had with my grandmother about this in the morning, only that she seemed upset and was tight-lipped, and that she and my great-grandfather went out to look for that exact tree later that day. They didn't find anything, and my grandfather didn't want to hear about it anymore, so I shrugged it off. Years later I would learn what skinwalkers are. I would think back to the young man and how he could have been a skinwalker, how his overalls could have been deerskin. I would also think that my experience didn't line up with other skinwalker encounters. I didn't feel any fear. I didn't notice a stench and no one called my name. Also, the young man seemed to be afraid of me. Then again, I suppose if I were looking for something and I saw a small child staring at me at a window, I'd probably be pretty freaked out too. As time went on, I had for the most part convinced myself that I had just happened to have witnessed a teen boy hunting illegally in our property, and my startling him startled the deer he was after, and my child brain just processed it strangely. That is, until I decided to bring up the concept of skinwalkers to my mother. I had told her about what I could have possibly seen one day when I was a child. When she said, "Oh, you saw the Birdman too, huh?" My belief that I misremembered a teen boy hunting shattered. She wouldn't say much about it when I seemed confused, simply stating, "Oh, there was an old balding man who would dance around the roof with his belt made of feathers, and when I would go out there to yell at him for being so loud, he'd smile at me and fly off like a bird." My apologies, because I'm definitely not a writer, so I'm just going to try to tell you my story exactly how it happened. And if you have any answers or explanations, please let me know. For some basic background information, I'm 16 and I live in the western United States, and I am active in rodeo. This happened in late winter. My brother and a close friend, who for the sake of the story we will call T, got permission from a local reservation to use their arena to practice roping. We got there early in the morning, so we would have all the time we needed. Now, mind you, my brother's horse and T's are both very even-tempered, and don't spook very easily. My mare, on the other hand, will panic at the littlest of things. She can be a handful most of the time, to be quite honest. Since the moment we got there, all of our horses seemed to be on edge. We shrugged it off and figured once they got to know their surroundings a bit more, they should be fine. After spending the better part of the day throwing ropes and chasing cattle, we decided to go for a ride on the trail and explore the area. By now, the horses seemed to have calmed down quite a bit. There is a river that ran close to the arena, so we decided to go explore down and check down to the river and give the horses a drink. Once we got about 30 yards away from the water, we could smell what could only be described as a rotting dead animal. Then something in the tree line caught the attention of all the horses, and after that, mine flat out refused to go any further. Being tired from a long day and frustrated by my horse's lack of cooperation, we all decided to call it a day. By this time, it was too late to load our gear and horses and take them back, so we decided it was just best to leave them there for the night, and stay at T's because she lived closer to my brother than I. We got their stalls ready for the night, got them fed and watered, and headed over to one of T's family friends who offered to cook us dinner. After some good food, good laughs, and a few good games of pool, the weird encounter by the river was out of mind. When 9 o'clock rolled around, we all wanted to get some sleep, but I wanted to check on the horses one last time before we left, and when I mentioned this to T, his family friend warned me not to go there alone at night. Wanting to respect that, T offered to drive down with me. We got in the truck and headed back to the arena. It was only about a half-a-mile drive, but the road was very icy, so we had to drive slower than what I thought would have, been possible, to be honest. Before crossing the bridge that went over the river, this feeling of dread hit me like a ton of bricks. I looked out the window just to be met with those glowing yellow eyes I will never forget. They are hard to describe. There was not enough light hitting them to make them glow the way they did. I am normally a very rational person, but something in my gut told me that this thing was very wrong. That's when T turned to me and said, "Do you smell something bad, or is it just me?" At that point, I hadn't even noticed anything, honestly. When I didn't respond, she looked at me, then met my gaze just to see the same yellow-eyed glare that I was fixated on. We were both in terror, not knowing what this thing was. Where it sat, it looked like it could have been at least 8 feet tall, and there are no animals in their parts that large. I finally came to my senses and hit the gas, and our truck started sliding. But we cut traction and made our way back to the arena. When we pulled up, the headlight hit the horses. The very first thing I noticed was my mare hadn't even touched her food, and for her, that's very out of the ordinary, because she's kind of a pig and normally eats more than her fair share. The other two hadn't eaten either, which again we found very odd, but being scared and cold, we got back in the truck and drove back without incident. We got to T's at about 11, and as soon as our heads hit the pillows, we were out like a light. All of a sudden, I woke up to my brother grabbing my arm and shaking me. I asked him what was wrong. He just put his finger over his mouth and pointed to the window. There was a tapping on the glass, and occasional scratching. I looked at the clock and it was 3 a.m. T and I hadn't told him about our encounter on the bridge, but it was late and I wasn't going to tell him now and scare him even more. Trying to be rational, I told him just to ignore it and try to get some sleep, but knowing what had happened, I was convinced it was the thing from the reservation and it had followed us back. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and as soon as the sun was up, I woke up T and my brother so we could go get our horses and get home, because I wanted my poor girl out of there and no longer with that thing. I told T about the tapping and scratching, so after coffee we went to look by our window for tracks, and sure enough, there was what looked like deer hooves, but they didn't track like normal deer. It was as if it was bipedal. This spooked us, but we just wanted to go see if our horses were okay, so we headed back to the reservation. They were all fine, but the food and water were still untouched. We got loaded up and out of there as fast as we could. As we drove over the bridge one last time, I looked into the tree line just to see a massive buck staring at me. He was large, and I mean unnaturally large. Very, very sickly looking though at the same time. His skin was just falling from his bones, and his legs bent the wrong way. That wasn't even the worst part though. His face. Those same ungodly yellow eyes. But when I made eye contact, I swear this thing, whatever it was, smiled at me with the most sickening smile I'd ever seen, with those yellow, pointed teeth. I've never really believed in the paranormal or humanoid creatures before, but when I was 16, I and my close friend used to love to hunt. Now, we lived in Texas, and this had to be around October or so. We were in a hunting stand that my friend and his dad built a few months back. We were sitting up there. It had to be around 10 p.m. We had 2 rifles and were hunting wild hog that's very overpopulated in the area. Plus, they were digging holes in my friend's yard and uprooting everything. My friend's yard was around 4 acres and had 2 ponds. One was on the side of his house and the other was in the very front. So, we were in the hunting stand, and this was located to the back left of the upper front pond, closest to the house. We were sitting there, staring at some clearing at the very back of the yard behind the pond, waiting for some hogs to come to the feeder about 80 feet in front of the stand. When we finally saw what we thought was a deer, we soon found out though, this was not a deer, but something very, very wrong. On our rifle we had infrared flashlights. They shined red, and if you didn't know, most animals can't see infrared. Shining these lights at the clearing, we saw what we thought was a deer, but legally we weren't allowed to shoot at them because it wasn't deer season, so we waited for it to pass. But it just stood there, looking at us, like it was fixated on me. Then, the absolutely unthinkable happened. The deer stood up on its hind legs. Me and my friend were shocked and started yelling. That wasn't a good idea. This thing screeched in what could only sound like a metallic yell. My hair stood up on the back of my neck as this thing sprinted at us with a sort of zigzag type of formation. Without hesitation, I pointed my rifle at it and fired 2 shots, one of which I believed hit the thing. It fell on its back, catching itself, allowing me to properly see it. This creature was pure gray. It looks extremely skinny, and the main reason we thought it was a deer was because of the rack of antlers on its head. In this few seconds of time, I seemed to be able to get a very good look at this thing, as everything seemed to be moving in very slow motion. When the creature got its bearings again, it hightailed it back into the woods, screeching that same metallic screech. Now, if anyone knows what this could be, please let me know. I would love to know. I'm still scared to go in that yard anymore past dark.
I had just parked at the local trail I often visit, when, about 30 seconds later, an older man parked next to me. He started leaning over as if to ask for directions. I rolled down my window, and he tried to peer into my car. Sensing something odd about this guy but dismissing it initially, I wondered if he needed anything. He said he was out for a walk and kept looking inside my car suspiciously. Then he asked if I wanted company for my walk. I usually go for my walks to be alone with my thoughts, so I wasn't interested, especially given his strange behavior. I politely declined and got out of my car. Despite this, he followed me and invaded my personal space, making me uncomfortable with his intense staring and lack of proximity. Although I'm a tall man and wasn't feeling physically threatened, his behavior was disconcerting. After walking together briefly, I excused myself
saying I needed to use the restroom and started walking faster to create a distance. When he tried to keep up, I told him I'd catch up later and quickly left the area, feeling uneasy. I feel guilty, thinking he may just be a lonely old man, but I believe I did the right thing. Usually, I'm not uneasy around others, but this interaction felt off. I prefer to trust my instincts in these situations, especially while out in the rural woods. "10 years ago, I, a male in my early to mid-40s, had an unusual experience. I was meeting a friend for coffee and arrived early, so I decided to spend some time at a small park before heading to the coffee place. It had a parking lot along the main road leading to the park. The park was an asphalt trail that went around a small oval-shaped pond, half-lined with a wooded area. Near the parking lot, there was a shelter, restroom, and kids' playground. It was a very sunny and warm, late morning, so I opened the driver's side window and the passenger side window just an inch or so. I was scrolling through emails on my phone when I noticed movement a few yards away on the trail. A young man in black sweatpants and a black hoodie was stretching with his back towards me. I was the only car parked in the lot at the time. I went back to my phone and emails when suddenly there was a pounding on the passenger side window. It was the guy who had been stretching just a minute ago. He scared the absolute ever-living crap out of me. I asked him, how can I help you? He didn't reply, but he put his face by the crack of the window and was grinning with a crazed look in his eyes. I quickly started the car up and shut both windows just as he dashed over to my side of the car and began trying to open the door. I honked the horn several times and shouted at him, asking him what the hell his problem was. He was still grinning like an idiot and not saying anything at all. Another car suddenly pulled into the lot and parked a couple of spaces away, and the grinning guy turned and ran off toward the woods. I pulled out, left the park, checking in my mirrors to make sure they weren't following me. This event weirded me out for some time afterward, and I was incredibly thankful that my car doors were locked and that I could close my windows before anything crazy happened. For some background, I'm a 24-year-old female who loves scary stories, horror movies, true crime, etc. It takes a lot to scare me, though I haven't experienced many terrifying, life-threatening events, fortunately. On to the story. This was during the middle of August in the summer of 2023 in North Texas, so the nighttime temperatures were around 100 degrees at the time. My dad and my 11-year-old brother drove an hour north into the countryside to go stargazing for my brother's Scout Merit badge. As they approached Black Creek Lake, they had to navigate some twisty gravel roads in the forest. My dad and my 11-year-old brother drove an hour north into the countryside to go stargazing for my brother's Scout Merit badge. As they approached Black Creek Lake, they had to navigate some twisty gravel roads in the forest. We saw a coyote, a deer, and 2 raccoons. We lived in a city, so we rarely got to see such animals. We thought that would be our excitement for the night. We then finally made it to the recreational park grounds beside the lake. Now the layout is rather simple. If you're standing in the round parking lot, the campgrounds are to the north and west. The lake is south, and the path in and out is to the east of us. No official campgrounds are east of this recreational area, which is essential for later. We got there around 10 p.m. and set up. We successfully saw some stars and Saturn through my telescope, which was pretty exciting. Throughout this whole time, though, there were 2 parties or what might have been one group in the parking lot and the surrounding area. Maybe there was one party kayaking or fishing or something to the west of us. To the north there were a couple of cars, and from that direction we constantly heard the loud, irritating voice of a woman who was obviously in a bad mood and did not want to be there. She continuously cursed at someone or something, and it seemed like it was never really anything in particular. At one point,
It seemed like they were so mad, and somebody was taking their keys or obstructing them from driving while they were clearly intoxicated. It was really hard to tell what was going on. At one point in the night, around 11 p.m., we hear someone sporadically honk one of the car horns repeatedly in random patterns. Then we hear the obnoxious woman rudely tell someone to wake up repeatedly, holding down the horn for a few seconds and continuing her assault on the horn with our ears. By this point, my family and I are just ready to leave due to this loud commotion. I was fixing to go over there myself and tell her off, but I knew that was probably not the best idea. I didn't want to put myself and my unborn baby in any danger. Then, for about 20 or 30 minutes, we would be able to watch the stars in relative peace with little noise from the other two parties. Fortunately, none of these people were directly involved in what happened next, but it may have been the cause of it. We packed our stargazing stuff just before midnight and got in the car. Now, the gravel path to the exit is up a slight hill or slope, meaning from the parking lot you can't see past where the path goes up and around a couple of trees. We drive up the hill, and just as the headlights come back down to illuminate the path in front of us, the trees to our right side, we see a man wearing only black shorts and no shirt. The timing is straight out of a horror movie. Suddenly seeing someone out of nowhere. He is in his late 20s or 30s and has short dark hair. Just as the light hits him, he was standing and walking right to the car, in front of us at a very close distance, only a couple of feet away. Upon seeing us, the guy had been walking in our direction and quickly raised his arms and flips us off with both hands. Then he runs off into the woods sporadically. He was raising his hands and arms quickly and loudly, saying something, expressing anger. It was hard to hear what he was saying since he was running away. I remember asking what he was doing, but everybody said, "Nope, we're getting the heck out of here." I knew that this was not a situation where we needed to stick around and ask questions. It freaked me out a little imagining what would have happened if that guy had reached the car a few seconds later if we hadn't sped off. I'm not very familiar with my dad's car, and it scares me that I might have ended up pressing the wrong button to lock my door. The guy could have opened it and done who knows what. We left and nothing else really happened. My best theory is that they were just a bunch of drunk people, maybe even just some methed out people, trying to have a good time, but things went left.
I'm not sure where to share this, but I've been freaking out for a few days now. I would love any advice anyone may have. I want to start by saying that everything that I'm about to talk about is absolutely true. And if you don't believe me, that's completely fine. I live in a woodsy area in the northwest of Ohio. My house is about a half a mile in the woods, down a long driveway, and my property is surrounded by trees from each side, except for the back, which has a field that alternates soybeans and corn every year. We're just a few minutes away from a very small village and about a half an hour away from bigger towns. I just wanted to give some background into the area before I say what happened, in case that helps at all. I've had some weird stuff happen before. I've encountered what I think are not deers. Once, there was one in my yard walking around apple trees, which isn't uncommon, but the thing was huge and absolutely ugly, and it just looked all wrong. There was also one next to a country road I was driving down with my friend once. A few years ago, I was dog sitting for some friends. I never had a dog at this point, but I did have some experience watching them. So I was out walking this dog near the field, and he turned around as there was a huge splash in our pond. He started growling and eventually howling. Other than that, the dog was really friendly, and I'd never heard him even growl before. I joked saying it was a frogman, like the Loveland frogman, but I ignored it for the most part. Last year, my family got a dog of our own, and he's a hound dog, so he chases and barks at pretty much everything. But sometimes, he gets weird about the pond too, and he'll growl and howl at it. He doesn't really growl other than that, and I have no further explanation on what is happening over there. But the incident that I came here to share about happened only a few days ago. This year is a corn year in the field behind our house, which I always hate because I can't see past the first couple of rows, and I've always thought that is pretty creepy. Before crops are planted, I like to rock hunt and metal detect in the field, surrounding the couple of woods scattered throughout the fields. there's a big creek that runs through it too. I mainly stick to the field directly behind my house because I don't have to wander out too far. The farthest out I've ever really gone is probably about a mile. A couple of days ago, I was out with my dog, walking along the line of dirt between the trees in the back of my property in the field, when my dog started growling at the corn. It obviously scared the hell out of me, and I was yelling at him to stop. When I was little, we would get coyotes around there all the time, so I figured it was more than likely a coyote. Since I didn't want myself or my dog to get hurt by the coyote, I started walking back to the house, but my dog just was not having it. He was pulling on the leash and baying and howling and losing his mind. He doesn't usually bay, and he doesn't howl unless there's a squirrel that's treed or something. So the fact that he was just screaming into the cornfield really freaked me out. We started walking again, and then I heard what sounded like a meow come from the corn. I was like, okay, it's just a cat, cool. But I have a cat, and there's plenty of barn cats that cross our property, and my dog has never once lost his mind over a cat like that before. So I keep tugging on his leash, and I'm like, dude, let's go, you're freaking me out. The cat keeps meowing, and it's getting very uncomfortably loud for a cat. It sounded like it was a lot closer than it actually was. And then this cat thing started growling, but it sounded more like a big dog, like these were massive growls. Then the corn started rustling, bigger than what a cat would ever be able to do. Luckily at that point I was just about to my backyard, and the growling kind of developed into what sounded like a yell or a scream from a human being. I was dragging my dog at this point. My dog was growling, his hair on his back sticking up. I was scared and shaking. I was absolutely terrified. I went back to my house and told my family what happened, and they were just like, okay, cool, whatever. But I was nearly in tears. It was scary. Again, I don't know if this is the right show to share this on, or if anybody will find this scary, but to me, in that moment, I was absolutely terrified. Nothing like this has ever happened since. Not that I want it to, but if anybody has any explanations or advice, please let me know in the comments down below. I grew up in a small southern town. When I was a kid back in the 70s and 80s, it was normal to ride our bikes everywhere, wade in nearby creeks and play deep in the woods. Where we lived, there were hundreds of acres of woods. There were several spots we could pretty much just enjoy playing where odd-shaped trees grew, grapevines hung over bank edges, or where clearings gave way to the joys of sunshine and wind. One of our favorite spots was relatively small with several crooked trees we could bounce on. It is hard to describe if you are not familiar with the wooded areas around here. This area is like an exceedingly small valley. It gets extremely hot in the south, so a valley with towering trees also gave us some good shelter from the hot summer sun. My sister and I had been playing for quite a while, and were getting pretty hungry. She went to the house, which was not very far away, to make some sandwiches for us. I watched as she walked off. As I stood thinking about clearing away some unwanted branches, I got this very odd feeling. I noticed it had gotten incredibly quiet, which sent a chill down my spine. Then, I saw something. I saw a shadow of someone or something that was standing on top of the hill behind me. At first, I thought it could be the owner of the property, who was kind of an elderly gentleman. He was normally nice, but he was not this tall nor this slim, and he would have spoken to me, I'm sure of it. Now, as a 10-year-old, I had learned that if I closed my eyes upon seeing a scary thing, it would be gone when I opened them. Maybe this sounds odd, but when I did this, either what I saw became explainable or simply would be gone and filed away as a figment of my large imagination. I closed and opened my eyes. The shadow remained. My heart was racing. I was frozen. Again, I closed and opened my eyes. The shadow remained. I noticed it moved its arm slightly. I continued to close and open my eyes, but this shadow was very real. I felt it stare. I have no doubt that it was watching me intently. After what seemed like forever, I heard my sister walking back. I watched her as she made her way back with the sandwiches in hand. She was talking, but when she saw me, she stopped and asked what was wrong. I looked down again at the shadow, but it was gone. I was no longer frozen in fear, and told her we needed to go home. I started running. My sister was so afraid she dropped our sandwiches as we got to our yard. I told her what I had just seen. Even as a 10-year-old, I was very practical and very skeptical. I decided to go back the next day at the same time and study shadows from that hill. My sister came with me, though she was afraid. I had her stand on the hill and stood where I had stood the day before, but my sister's shadow was normal. I tried several things, but I could not explain away the shadow I had seen. It was very tall. I estimated the height of the creature to have been at least 7 feet tall. I have seen a lot of strange things in my life. I can find logical explanations for most of them, but I know the shadow I saw in the forest that day was real, and it was not a human. I never saw it again, but I will never forget it. I used to live in northern Washington state, having moved there from the Midwest for work. The town I lived in was big enough as it had a university and was close to the Canadian border, but not very populated and mostly rural, forested, and mountainous. Like the Midwest where I am from, there is a good amount of wildlife there. I would see bald eagles, owls, hawks, raccoons, deer, and I would see cougar prints on hiking trails. Thankfully, I never crossed a cougar's path that I know of. In the Midwest, I have seen plenty of deer. I cannot throw a stick without hitting one. Black bear on several occasions, and even been terrifyingly close to a moose once on accident. I am telling you all this so you know that I am 100% sure what my brain told me at first was a deer was not a deer. On the night I saw it, several years ago, I was heading back to work at around 11 p.m. I had been working the overnight shift for several weeks at this point, so was pretty used to the weird time of being at work. I was not especially tired, and had already been awake for more than an hour, getting ready and had a cup of coffee in me. My commute consisted mostly of driving through flat land, since it is near the coast, with lots of trees broken up by some small fields. The road is lit with street lamps, but not enough to always be well lit the entire drive. I was coming around an unlit bend with a field on my right, and a thick, treed median on my left. I saw a deer walking away from the road in the field, so I immediately let my foot off the gas and looked for more that might be coming out of the trees. Rarely did I ever see a lone deer. Always at least 2 or more, sometimes as many as 10 crossing together. The deer was far enough ahead still walking that I looked back at it again as I passed by. As I passed it though, I realized that it was not a deer at all. It was just very wrong. I really do not know how else to describe it. It had stopped in the field, and it just was not a deer anymore, or anything like a deer. I think it was bigger than a deer at the very least, and I felt like it was observing me as I passed by it. I had that sinking feeling in my gut you get when something dreadful is about to happen. But I went past it, stepped on the gas, and got back to above the speed limit while gripping the steering wheel with all I had. Nothing dreadful happened, luckily, and I got to work just fine. I have moved to a different state now, but I used to always look out for that not deer thing whenever I drove by late at night. I have no clue what I would do if I saw it again. It was not the only weird thing that happened to me there, but it is the one I think the most about. In 2011, my uncle invited me on a trip with him and my 2 cousins. We stayed a night in Vegas, then rented an RV for a trip through Utah and Arizona. Our destination was the Grand Canyon. We spent a few days driving around to all the tourist destinations such as Eagle Point. Our nights were spent in RV parks that were found along the way. On our final leg of the trip, we headed to the Havasupai Indian Reservation. We got some awesome photos,
and went on a thoroughly interesting tour. Last night we were driving around looking for an RV park to sleep in. We did not want to rough it on the side of the road because it would be freezing cold, and we needed to empty the sewage tank. Unfortunately, our phones were giving us problems due to a poor signal. My uncle was tired of driving and determined we would have to pull over. We took this opportunity to stretch out and gaze. The stars looked beautiful in the night sky. We were in an incredibly rural, unpopulated area. There were hardly any other cars or people. As a result, there was absolutely no light pollution, and the stars glowed intensely. On one side of the long dirt road was a steep hill with borders and shrubs. On the other side, the canyon. To our surprise, the dark was broken by high beams coming toward us. A car was casually but slowly cruising down the road. The driver pulled over next to us and got out. From what I could tell, he was a Native American man, and he told us he was a local. His hat nearly covered his eyes, and his beard grew over his mouth. We greeted him respectfully and asked him if he knew of any RV parks. He said we were reasonably far from the tourist areas and that there were none over here. He asked us how we got here, and we told him that we were sort of driving aimlessly in hopes that we would find an RV park. He laughed and started to tell us about the part of the canyon that we were standing next to. He sounded like a tour guide spewing out facts. He offered to take us down an unmarked trail that only locals hiked. He said it was beautiful, had scenic spots. Beguiled by his backstory and knowledge, we agreed to follow him. For whatever reason. He got some hiking gear from his car and urged us to gather some of our own. We climbed into our RV and gathered our stuff. As I put on my boots, I watched him circle our RV through my window. Once we were ready, he led us a quarter-mile down the road. We reached his fabled location, and he shined his flashlight off down the edge of the cliff to show us the path. I knew this was not an official trail, but it did not look like a trail at all. We followed him down an incredibly steep bank with tons of loose rocks. He led us around a few turns and through several tight caverns. We found ourselves in a big, flat rock, and we stopped to take some pictures. He led us deeper and deeper into the canyon. "You want to go to the bottom?" he asked us. It was dark and we were tired, so we declined. We kept following him for about 10 minutes. We saw a few birds eating a small animal along the way. It struck me that we were truly in the untouched wilderness. We were uncomfortably close to the edge of the cliff many times. My uncle grew a bit uneasy and asked him to lead us back. He agreed and told us that he knew of a shortcut back up to where we came from. He told us to wait there and disappeared out of sight. We were all a bit nervous at this point because we had no idea where we were. We waited about 10 minutes or so, taking more photos to pass the time. Eventually, my uncle walked off in the direction the man left. My cousins and I were afraid to be alone. We trailed him tensely. He came back and told us he did not see the man. We waited another 10 minutes before giving up. "He's not coming back," my uncle told us. I began to wonder what could have happened to him. Did he fall? Did he get lost? Did he ditch us? I could not understand why he left us there. He seemed so friendly, and we were oddly eager to trust him. We started to hike back from whence we came. The problem was nobody really remembered where we came from. The terrain was incredibly unsafe, and we realized that we could not navigate it on our own. My uncle called out a few times, but the only response was his echo. We found ourselves testing ridges that we were certain we had not come across before. Foot placement was key, as many rocks were wobbly. Just my little cousin started to cry. We had to hold on to their jackets. It felt like we were lost in a labyrinth. My uncle remarked over and over that he knew it was a bad idea, but it was way too late now. Hindsight is always 20/20. Since this was not a real trail, there were no markings to help us. The only source of light came from our flashlights. I tried not to look over the edge because I had a small fear of heights, and we were incredibly high up. I did not want to be in the back of the pack, but I did not really want to lead it either. I just wanted to be back in the RV. Our anxiety was building as the moon sank. To keep the spirits up, we joked that we could survive a night in the canyon since my cousin was an Eagle Scout. However, we were merely trying to take our minds off the situation. Finally,
After what felt like forever, we found ourselves on that same big flat rock. We recognized the series of caverns we crossed through and climbed back out. It was a relief when we got back on the dirt road. We walked towards our RV, looking for the man as we staggered on. We came upon our RV, but the man's car was gone. He left us. We quickly put the pieces together. We were angry and felt incredibly foolish. As I got closer to our RV, I noticed that the door was creaked open. I remember locking it when we left. Immediately, tears built up in my eyes. I was not sure if the adrenaline had gotten the best of me, or if I truly had a reason to be afraid. "Hold on," my uncle said, as we swung open the door. My cousins and I were too afraid to go inside, but we were not particularly content about being outside either. My uncle took a few steps into the RV and blurted out, "Guys, we've been robbed." We piled into the RV and froze. None of us wanted to venture too deep in. I began thinking all of the stuff that I had stored in there. Our suitcases were thrown on the floor, clothing was scattered, my iPad was gone, my uncle's wallet was gone, my cousin's jewelry was gone, and my other cousin's phone was gone, amongst other things. I felt so violated. We were all so silent for quite a bit, and none of us really slept. My uncle started the RV and we drove off, looking for civilization. Fortunately for us, we had enough gas to make it to the RV rental place. We phoned the police and they filled out a report, but nothing ever came of it. My word of advice, if someone asks you to go down to the bottom of the canyon, always say no.